Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the UK economy. Because in the run-up to the latest data being published, a lot of commentators were saying that the UK could technically fall into recession at the end of 2024. When we got the quarter figures for the final quarter, if it came in as a reduction of GDP, that technically could classify as a recession because it had 0% growth in the third quarter. So you'd have 2 quarters of no growth. However, the UK has exceeded all expectations. It's knocked the ball out of the park with astonishing growth of 0.1% for the final quarter of 2024. And yes, that is slightly tongue-in-cheek in terms of my delivery because a 0.1% growth is virtually no growth whatsoever. And the only politician that's currently laughing in the UK is this guy. And we'll go into the details as to why Nigel Farage has got such a big smile on his face later. And potentially we could be seeing this scenario at some point in the very near future if a general election was called in the UK. But we'll get onto that detail in a moment. Let's first talk about what's actually happened with GDP. This chart shows the quarterly movement in GDP in the UK dating back to the start of 2022. And if we look at what's been happening over the past 2 years, you can see why there are major concerns about the UK economy. At the start of 2023, the UK recorded quarterly growth of 0.1%. That fell to 0% in the second half of 23, and then the UK then fell into recession as it recorded a fall of 0.1% in the third quarter and 0.3% in the fourth quarter. Now, the economy did bounce back at the start of 24 with 0.7% growth. However, as with any of these statistics, you always need to look at what that's being measured against. And that 0.7% growth was measured against the 0.3% fall for the previous quarter. So everything is relative here. The level of growth fell to 0.4% in the second quarter of 24. There was zero growth in the third quarter. And as I mentioned at the start of today's video, in the fourth quarter of 24, the UK achieved 0.1% growth. And in terms of what that means on an annualised basis, this chart shows the year-on-year movement in GDP for the UK, dating back to 2013. And you can see on the far right-hand side of this chart that in 2024, the UK achieved year-on-year growth of 0.9%, which on the positive side is more than double the 0.4% growth achieved in 2023. However, as we just discussed, the UK fell into a recession during 2023, so that's not really a very strong benchmark year. And if you take a step back and look at the overall picture here, you can see that 0.9% growth in 24 is actually the third worst performance at any time in the last 12 years, with the only 2 years that were worse being 2023 and the COVID-affected year 2020. So where do the latest figures leave the UK economy and the UK government? Well, the 0.9% growth in 2024 is actually lower than the original forecast by the OBR, the Official Statistics Bureau, that provide data to the government on which they base all of their taxes and planning. The OBR was expecting the full year GDP to grow by 1.1%. And if we look at this chart, which compares the forecast by the Office for Budget Responsibility from 2024 out to 2028, against the forecasts made by the Bank of England, the central bank in the UK, you can start to get a feeling as to why there are now problems in the UK economy. The yellow line here shows the OBR's forecast GDP figures for the next 4 years. And as you can see, it's the most optimistic of the 3 lines shown here. The pink line is the Bank of England forecast that was presented in November 24, and the black line at the bottom is the most recent forecast that was published in February 25. So the Bank of England is now a lot more pessimistic about what the UK is going to achieve in terms of GDP growth in 25, 26, 27 and 28 than the OBR figures. And the problem with this is that the government has based all of its budget, all of its planned expenditure and taxes on achieving the OBR results. And it now looks very unlikely that those OBR figures are going to be hit. So that means that fundamentally, the figures that the UK government has based all of its assessments on are incorrect. And the reason why this is important is because Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so the person who's in charge of setting taxes and all of the expenditure, has set herself a very thin amount of headroom in terms of the difference between what she's expecting to recoup from all of the taxes and what the government is going to spend. And she said categorically that she will want to live off what she's earning. So basically, she needs to balance the books between the taxes that are coming in and the expenditure that's going out. She doesn't want to increase borrowing. She doesn't want to put a greater debt burden onto the UK economy. And this chart compares the amount of headroom that was included in the October 24 budget by Rachel Reeves against the headroom included in all of the previous budgets dating back to 2010. And as you can see from the far right-hand side of this chart, the green bar, which represents the most recent budget, is significantly below the long-term average, which is shown by the dotted line, and came in somewhere in the region of 25 to 30 billion pounds. And it was recently reported that the OBR has now cut its own forecast, so they're lower than the figures that we just looked at in that graph. However, the next meeting between Rachel Reeves and the OBR is not set until the 19th of February. There's then a following one on the 4th of March, at which they will decide the final figures ahead of the next budget on the 26th of March. And this is going to be a really interesting budget because if Rachel Reeves doesn't have the amount of income that she originally forecast back in October, then she's going to fall short in terms of her income. And so she'll have two choices, either to increase taxes, which she said categorically she won't do. She'd have to go against her own decision on that if she does decide to push taxes up, or she'll need to cut spending, and that would mean a cut to the public budget. So things like the NHS might get less funding. So it's a rock and a hard place for Rachel Reeves at the moment. And all of this news has resulted in a fall in popularity for Labour. This poll, which was undertaken by YouGov on the 9th and 10th of February 2025, asked people who they would vote for in a general election in the UK if it was held tomorrow. And what this revealed is that 21% of the people surveyed said that they would vote for the Conservative Party, which was the former ruling party in the UK. 25% said that they would vote for Labour, which is the current party that's running the UK. And 26% said that they would vote for Reform UK, who currently only have 5 MPs. Now, if you follow UK politics, you'll know that over the last 60 years or so, there have really been only two parties that have been in power, the Conservatives and Labour, blue or red. It tends to be a vote for one or the other. There have been some times when a coalition government had been formed, but that's usually with a minority group. But what we're seeing in this poll is that a new party is now leading the way. And as I mentioned right at the start of today's video, the leader of that party is Nigel Farage, who is having a right laugh at the moment because this party came from his old UKIP party. At the time prior to the Brexit vote, Nigel Farage suddenly came to prominence. Nobody had heard of him really before that, but he suddenly came out and said the UK needs to leave Europe. He was very firmly for leave voting, and obviously that's what the majority of people who voted in favour of. So the UK has now left Europe. So obviously UKIP, as it was called, the United Kingdom Independence Party, didn't really have much purpose beyond that Brexit vote because they'd achieved what they wanted to achieve. So Nigel Farage set up a new party, originally called Reform and now called Reform UK, which is a right-wing party that wants to do lots of things that are quite radical. And it's now gaining lots of support, partly because the economy isn't doing very well. So when times are not good, people get disgruntled. And it was recently reported that 2/3 of wealthy Britons who voted for Labour, and wealthy is defined as having assets of more than £250,000, now regret their decision to vote for Labour. So what are the chances of Reform actually winning power in the UK and Nigel Farage becoming Prime Minister? Well, if I'd have shown you this photo 6 months ago and said that these two guys could be the leaders of some of the biggest economies in the world within the next couple of years, you probably would have laughed as much as they're laughing. However, given the fact that Donald Trump won the US election and Nigel Farage is now the frontrunner in the UK polls, it's not impossible that we could see those two guys running the US and the UK at some point in the near future. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening in the UK economy right now is really quite fascinating. The new government that came into power in the summer of 2024 has published its budget back in October, but unfortunately, the fundamentals that were underpinning that budget now look to be flawed because the UK hasn't come in at the level of growth that it was initially expected to. And so the trajectory over the next 12 to 18 to 24 months is now much lower than originally expected. And what that means is that the UK is not producing as much GDP. Therefore, companies and individuals won't earn as much, so they won't pay as much tax. And so the UK government will have less revenue to play with. They've worked out all their calculations based on the original forecasts. So they've now got less cash than they hoped for. And so they're going to have to make a very difficult decision when it comes to the March 25 budget, which isn't that far away now. Either taxes will need to be increased further, and we had a £40 billion tax increase in October of 24. And at that time, Labour said there wouldn't be any further tax increases. So it would be a huge U-turn if Labour announced that it is going to increase taxes. Or it could cut spending. But the problem in cutting spending is that public services obviously don't grow at the same rate. Therefore, people aren't employed at the same rate. And it does have a negative knock-on impact to GDP. So this could become quite circular. And as we saw from the data, the final quarter GDP growth was only 0.1%, which actually could get adjusted in the roundings. Quite often after the initial figures are published, there will be adjustments made. And so that could get adjusted back down to 0% anyway. But 0.1% is very fractionally above zero. If you think about it in terms of your savings, if you've got savings in your bank and your bank turned around and said, it's fantastic news, we're going to offer you an interest rate of 0.1%, you'd move your money immediately. That isn't any sort of growth whatsoever. So 0.1% for the UK economy, whilst it is positive, it isn't a recessionary situation. It isn't really what the UK economy needs. It needs to be achieving much better growth than that. And the problem that we're looking at is if the budget in March does announce higher taxes or some other way of raising additional revenue for the state that's going to be detrimental to long-term growth, then obviously that's going to have a further knock-on impact in terms of what happens in 6 months and 12 months and 18 months' time. So the overall summary of today's video is that the UK, whilst it has avoided a technical recession in the final quarter of 2024, is a long way from being out of the woods. It needs to start seeing significant growth. In order to do that, companies need to be allowed to expand, take on more people, maybe pay people more. But the problem that companies have is that they were hit with higher taxes in October. A lot of businesses are still struggling with that. And so we're hearing mixed messages in terms of business confidence in the UK at the moment. And the UK government is now looking at a smaller pool of cash because growth hasn't come in as expected at the end of 24. The forecast for 25 is now lower than originally expected, and all of that means that the government is going to be short of funds, and so it's going to have to make a really difficult decision when the next budget is announced, either to increase taxes and go against its own statements or to cut its spending, which wasn't part of its manifesto when it was voted into power. So it will be a rock and a hard place for Rachel Reeves once more. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.